So one of the things that I started to notice in working with my female leaders is that, let's just say this is equality. Let's just say this is the power that women have earned in the world. I often see my leaders operating here. Not because they're not capable, but something happens in situations where they defer or hold back, and it's baffling to me. So I just started watching and seeing what I saw and seeing what seemed to be themes across the different leaders, how that differed from the male clients that I work with, and started to just distill some of this. And so this is what you're going to see. And by the way, I am very intentional about using binary terms because, again, this is the world we're operating in, and part of what I want to do is start to dismantle that in using those binary terms. So I just want you to know I'm being very intentional about that, and that I think that's part of the problem. So as we go through this, I also want to talk about how we limit power, how show you how to identify when you're limiting that power, and then finally to show you kind of what do we do with that? How do we move from limit to less limit? So I want to actually just really very clearly define what I mean when I say limiting beliefs. What I mean is something that has happened, an actual experience that you've had, but it's where your mind is focused on the challenges or the deficits or the gaps or the failures, essentially the circumstances. So an example of limiting is it's hard. A breakthrough belief, on the other hand, is also true, but it has you putting your attention on what you're capable of, what you're aspiring towards, what you think is possible, what you're hopeful about, and what you want to create. All these things are true as well. So an example of a breakthrough belief would be, I do hard things. So they're both true. It's hard, and I do hard things. But what happens with limiting beliefs is that they're going to persist because it's something that really happened. Your brain isn't just going to say all of a sudden that's not true. It's very much true. That's why it sticks around. So what a breakthrough belief does is it doesn't try to compete with a limiting belief. It doesn't try to make it untrue. It just says it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if it's hard if I'm someone who does hard things. So that's the premise of a limiting belief and a breakthrough belief, and what we're trying to help people understand is like where they're only looking at 3 of those attributes instead of the entire spectrum of 6, and they're choosing the ones that are the least empowering instead of the ones that are the most empowering. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So around this notion of women in power and stereotypes and roles and how women are defined, there was this quote that I thought was particularly useful, and one that this is really what I want this experiment to be for you today and always, which is how, as we start to examine power, particularly women in power, where is it that we're hearing, oh, women aren't powerful or women don't fit the mold? Why are we trying to change women instead of changing the definition of power? So that's an opportunity just to continue to examine that. One of our colleagues, Susan Burnett, does a lot of leadership work, and she points out that when women get feedback in performance situations, it often has to do with leadership characteristics instead of business execution characteristics. So what that means is they're not getting feedback on the core and fundamental things that put you in a position to lead better. Instead, they're being judged by this higher bar that they should be at already, when many of their peers aren't judged at that same bar. So part of, one thing very tactically for you guys to do is when you get feedback, really ask for the feedback around operational excellence. What is it tactically and technically that you need to do to really get results? And get that feedback first, and then hone your leadership skills, or in addition to that, hone your leadership skills. So just this idea around what power is and who are we trying to change and what needs to shift, or fundamentally for us to step further into it. The way that I define power, and this is actually very aligned with the definition that Dr. Pfeffer offered around options and how do you create options for yourself, or in the absence of options is being dependent on someone else. The way we define it at the Dignitas Agency is your ability to perform in a way that gets you your intended outcome. And we're very, very clear about ability. And I'll tell you a little bit more around when we parse that out, what that looks like. And it's regardless of the circumstance, because remember, we're working with people who are coming from underrepresented populations, so there will always be circumstances. If no other circumstance, you will most likely be one of the few people that looks like you. That will almost always be a circumstance that you're in. In the best case, there will not be any bias in that situation, but given the way human brains work, I don't know that we're ever going to get there. So given that reality, how do we show up more powerfully anyway? And that's the work that we do, is helping people do that. So what Dr. Pfeffer said, I wrote down, he said, the world is unjust and unfair. Get over it. That's our point here. He said, be as agentic as possible. So he's talking about agency. And that's actually what this model is talking about, is how do I get more and more agency inside of a system so that I have more and more sponsorship? In his words, it was support. And then finally, develop resilience and a way to kind of stay in it, that grit. And that's part of what we're going to talk about that as well. So he kind of laid the foundation of, here's how the world works, here's what you need to do. What I want to do is pick up and say, well, how do we actually do that? How do you actually embody that? And how do you take it from common knowledge to common practice? So I want to make some distinctions. Looks like my font here didn't turn out. That's not me trying to be artistic. There's a couple of distinctions that I really want the women that I work with to understand. Now, these are distinctions also that my men that I work with have to grapple with, but somehow it doesn't seem to be as problematic for them. And so the first one is the notion of being needed versus being valued. What I mean by that is the female leaders that I work with spend a lot of time wanting people to need them. There's a feeling that they get from that matters. Now, what's interesting is some of that stuff where they're needed has zero value to the organization. Guess who ends up taking most of the notes in meetings? I'm not saying those notes don't add value. I'm just saying that they don't get valued for doing that work. When next time you have an office party, who's doing the work? Next time you have an operational thing that actually doesn't hit the bottom line, guess who's generally responsible for that? My male leaders do a much better job of aligning themselves to the actual declared value that organization is driving, and finding roles and navigating into roles that matter around that. So the downside of not doing that, I'll get to that in a second. Let me hit all three of these first. So the second distinction that I like people to make is this idea of seeking permission versus being in power. So I can't tell you how many times I will listen to my female leaders, and they're waiting on someone to give them permission to do something that the job has already defined as their responsibility. They're looking for relational buy-in when they don't actually need it, because the role has already defined that this is what you're supposed to do. Now, I'm not saying that they don't need followership and have to influence. That's different. But they're looking for permission to actually do the thing that they were hired to do, and they don't even realize it. So that's another thing to look for. And my worry about this one is that if you've earned this much power, they've hired you into the role because you've earned this much power, but you only show up here, people are going to start to say, why isn't this person leading the way I expected them to? And it's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy around the bias around women not being strong leaders. That's what I worry about. And then the third distinction that we talk about is control versus leverage. So this is where something's not going the way that my female leaders want it to go. So instead of using their power to either make a hard decision or influence, instead they say, well, I'll just do it myself. Or they spend a ton of time doing someone else's job so that it gets done the way they want it to. It looks exactly the way they want it to. And they're missing the point of what leverage is about. You have people there so they can do the job, not so you can do the job for them. So it ends up exactly how you want it. So instead of calibrating on outcome, they're calibrating on, is it the way that I want it? Which is a slightly different thing. So these are the three things that we have our women leaders looking at in terms of distinctions. So what happens when you overcalibrate on need versus value, you get overlooked. You're doing the stuff that no one cares about inside the organization. And so when promotion comes around, you don't have a story to tell around value. when you're seeking permission instead of acting from a place of power, you get overrun. So this is the example that I like to bring up here is the issue of women being talked over in meetings. I have a very different reaction to that when it happens. So certainly it happens. I'm sure I've gotten talked over in meetings. I'm positive it's happened. I don't actually remember those times that much, because what happens is when it occurs in a meeting, I worked at Deloitte, and one of the things you learn in a consultancy is that you get like 2 minutes to say something that matters, or else people stop listening. So what I learned was when you step into a boardroom, your job is to add value. If someone's talking over to you, that is a signal that you're not adding as much value as you could, so go back and get better. That's how I learned how to operate inside of a boardroom. So when I get talked over, I take it as feedback to go back and get better. Now, might there be some gender issues going on? I'm sure there are, but it's not the most empowering place for me to plug in. Now, if we want to talk about shifting the dynamic of boardrooms in general, totally get it, that it could be a nicer place. I wouldn't be opposed to having boardrooms be a nicer place. But what's also happening is men get talked over all the time in boardrooms too. It's what happens in boardrooms. So the way I hear that conversation around, hey, we're getting talked over, let's change the dynamic of boardrooms, is I hear that as us asking for permission. Stacy, will you please talk now? It's your turn. That would be polite and it would be nice, and I'd appreciate that. But guess what? That's not the world we operate in right now. So if we keep waiting for the world to change and invite us, we're going to get overrun. So the point here, especially if I've triggered you in the way that I was just triggered in the last presentation, is not that we don't want to change it. It's just that you have to understand how the game works in the first place. You have to be able to perform inside of that game and shift it from that place, from a place of power. So you have to get that power first. Part of the way you get that power is by embodying the most empowering perspective that you can when you show up to a place. So then the last distinction, leverage versus control, is this is where, literally I will see this. My female leaders have their job, which by the way in today's environment is always 2+ jobs for anybody. Then they're doing the job of their team that they think can't do what they need them to do instead of just getting someone that can do the job because they don't want to have a conflict conversation. And then, by the way, when they go home, especially if they live in a heteronormative environment at home, then they got 2 more jobs. So there's like 6 jobs that my female leaders have, and they're trying to compete with male colleagues who have maybe 1.5. So it's just like, that's a lot of weight to carry. So one of the most, maybe, I don't know if I can get kicked out of a room when I'm actually on stage, but one of the things that I actually say to my female leaders is before you start to fight for equality outside of your home, check out what's going on inside of your home. Because that is the place where you have the most influence. And by the way, if you handle it there, I don't have to do this work because men will show up differently. And they're going to listen to you before they listen to me. So I want you guys to hang out with that. Because quite frankly, most people who live in heteronormative environments can't see where they have given up power, control, and where they are not on equal footing with their partners. Because it's just the way the world is. So I'm going to try to raise some things that will help examine that a little bit. So as you guys are considering these distinctions, here's some questions for needed versus valued. So are the domains where you've earned power viewed as powerful for everybody else? Doesn't matter if you have power in a place that no one cares about. Are you on the main track or are you on a parallel track? So does anybody care about this area of business that you're working on, or is it just kind of experimental and as long as you don't blow anything up, have fun? But when it comes time to promotion, succession planning, the path to power, no one's really concerned about that detour you're on. Are you doing the corporate housework? So those are some questions to ask yourself there. Questions around permission. Where are you looking to be rescued? I can't tell you how many times, literally, I just was in a meeting yesterday with a leader, a chief of staff, a very senior person, who said she's in this new role, and her boss said to her, I need you to speak up in meetings. I need you to actually be more vocal. So she the next time around, she was very vocal in the meeting, and her boss said, that was fantastic. Not only did you plug in the right points and you weren't just trying to say things to fill the space, you were relevant, you were on point. And I looked at her and I said, why did she have to ask you? You are a senior leader. You know you're capable. You know your job is to have impact. What are you waiting on? And this happened, when I share these examples with you guys, it's not one person. This is across a book of business of people that I work with. So this shows up again and again and again. The president at BTS, Jessica Parisi, she tells this story. She just told this story a couple months ago to a large group. She was, our colleague Susan Burnett is doing some work with leaders, and it says, that women, when they're asked for position of power in the succession conversation, they'll list all the reasons why they're not ready. And the men will say, put me in, I'm ready, whether or not they're ready. It's not about competency, it's about willingness to just jump in. And Jessica says to Susan, no, I don't think that's true. I don't think I operate that way. And she said, well, let me tell you the word on the street about you, because she's fairly new in her role. And she's the one telling the story to the group. She said, when they asked me, what I said was, here are the things that I would have to get better at in order to do this job well, because that's the way I was processing it. That's what I was thinking about in my mind, but I knew I could do the role. But in expressing that, the impression that she left was, she's not ready. Whereas her counterparts were just saying, I'm ready. They might have had the same internal dialogue going, but they engaged in the conversation very, very differently. So that's another thing to think about around permission, is that you might not be asking for permission, but you might be signaling that to someone else, or it might be interpreted that way. So just something that, like, why do I feel the need to express all of the things that I'm not ready around? Just something to think about. And then, when are you asking help when you can actually do it for yourself? So these are all kind of in that territory, where sometimes we don't realize that the language that we're using is actually saying, I need help, when we haven't even tried to do it ourselves. And part of that comes from our own discomfort and wanting to get it right. So how do we self-manage in a way that we're projecting competence, power, effectiveness that is on par with what we actually bring to the table, and not do it in a way that has a self-deprecating effect? And then lastly, just looking to see, where are you in control? Meaning, where are you trying to manage an outcome versus leverage people to get an outcome? The second one is there value in controlling the thing that you're trying to control? And do you secure power, or is it just another thing on your to-do list by doing that thing? So when you're controlling, is there some type of strategic outcome to controlling it, or is it just so you can say you got stuff done? So that's a set of things that you can examine. You can use all these questions to kind of see where you are across these distinctions. So I want to just revisit this definition of power, because we're going to talk about what gets in the way of it. So again, it's the ability to perform regardless of the circumstances. That's really what we're talking about around power. So it's personal power. It's, how do I show up? How do I have command and centeredness myself so that I can be the most effective, the fullest version of myself? So there's this thing that we call the power quotient. And I want to introduce a new word here, willingness. So it's the willingness to exercise the earned power in ways that drive an intended result. So the ability to perform is one thing. But inside of that, so inside of ability, it's competence and willingness. There's two pieces to it. So if you're not willing, if the power that you've earned is here, but you're only operating here, this is unwillingness. That's what I want us to look at. So, I was talking to tech people, so I put it in a math equation, and he said it works, but I'm not, don't ask me any technical questions about the math here. But if you think about power, your ability to be powerful as two parts, the earned power and your willingness to act. I want to split that out even more, because I think this is interesting, because people might be saying, oh, I am willing to act. But what I've noticed is that my female clients are much more willing to act in indirect ways around power. And they count that as action, and it is counting. But what happens when you have to act directly? Where do you go there? And these are the places where I will see someone show up extremely powerfully in one scenario, and then they'll walk into another one that often is characterized by being male dominant and conflict laden, and they'll show up completely differently. And I got really curious about that. So why don't women act directly? That's my question that I'm looking at. And so I think it has everything to do with our ability to actually vision in the most creative and expansive ways. So the first type of belief I shared with you was a limiting belief. The next type that I shared with you was a breakthrough belief. This belief right here is what's the lady that said, until we've eradicated cancer, we don't get to talk about my personality? That's this. She walks into the room with a purpose, with an understanding that there's a job to do, with an understanding that it might be hard, but I'm going to figure out a way to do it anyway. And the equivalent of that, so it's hard, I do hard things. How about I will? There's a very different energy to those three. I will is like, I don't actually know how I'm going to do this because I've never been in that territory before. But guess what? Whatever I meet, I'm going to figure it out in that moment. This is an anti-fragile view. This is a view that says stress is actually going to make me better. And I don't actually have to know everything. I just have to know enough to be able to figure it out. This is the attitude that I think allows us to go into those challenging situations, those conflict situations, those situations where we're underrepresented, and be powerful regardless. So, we kind of played with the model a little bit, and we added, what would the creative belief be that's tied to each of the limiting beliefs? And so you can see that there's a grit associated to these creative beliefs. Because there's a belief that I don't know how to do this, I just know I'm going to figure it out. There's a trust that you have in yourself. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about, if that's the journey, that's the destination to get to this place of anti-fragility so that we can lead no matter what and as powerfully a way as we can, what gets in the way of that? Why don't we live there? Why don't we live in that belief set? Well, I have a feeling it's these things. It's the story that gets told about who women are. It's the story that we believe about who we are. It's the story that we allow ourselves to be tied to, attached to. Because there's a lot of value in that, by the way. There's a lot of value in being defined because you have some level of certainty. There's a value in having a position and a role in a place inside of a system. And there's comfort here, quite frankly. But with all types of comfort, sometimes it gets uncomfortable after a while. And so if you want to lead, I think examining this discomfort is really interesting. So I want to share some roles that often get attached to woman. So this story of princess, we've all heard it from probably before we were even born. The stories that people read to us inside of our mothers. There's this narrative of mother. These are all the female, not all of them, but many of the female archetypes. Daughter. What's interesting about each of these is that they have a counterpart, a male counterpart usually. And relative to that male counterpart, there's usually some type of subordination, some type of need to be saved, rescued, cared for, supportive, deferential to. There's lots of good things inside of these things as well, but they really don't line up with what we define a leader as. Now, I think over time, we've tried to do the best we can inside of these roles and these narratives and kind of empower ourselves inside of them. But sometimes it feels like shifting chairs around on the Titanic. Like maybe these roles, the way they're defined, just aren't that useful to us. Like what happens if we just don't have an expectation around these things? What happens if we just interact with each other as humans? What becomes possible there? I think there are some people that think all hell would break loose. And maybe it would. But then what gets created on the other side of that? That's what's interesting. Because, by the way, that's the very same thing as a definition of a leader. A leader deals with uncertainty. A leader actually encounters chaos and makes sense of it and then decides where we want to go from there. So it's very interesting that, what happens if we dissolve these roles and just step inside of what a leader does? And how would we define ourselves then, if that's how we viewed ourselves? Interestingly, when you ask people, there's an experiment out there, is when you ask people what is a leader, they always draw male figures. For most people, we don't even entertain the fact that women can lead. Even women. So this is, people in general draw this, not men. We ourselves don't see ourselves as leaders. So I just want to give it a couple of examples how this shows up in common culture. So this was an exchange on Facebook. Me, I have some great news for you. I have some news for you. The friend, you said, yes, you're pregnant. You bought a house. I'm so excited for you. So do you hear all the expectations and roles, and that this is actually the highest expectation that someone can imagine for someone they care about? And we've all heard this. How many of us get to a certain age and it's like, are you married yet? Not how are you, what's going on in your life, but you get reduced to this expectation. And by the way, these expectations are fine if you actually want them. Right? My assumption is if you want this, great. But if it's not, or if it's placed upon you and it limits you in some way, then it's not all that useful. Silly friend tricks, blah, blah, blah. I got those expensive but worthwhile bed sheets, and now I'm excited. So this thing that no, this is about me. I'm excited about me. And just you just make this so difficult. How dare you account for yourself? So just these are the things that we hear all the time, and we just don't even think about. So this one is a little bit longer. It's small. So my wife has a degree in architecture. She worked in construction and building and renovation for 10 years and knows 1,000 times more than I do about any of that. I barely know what a hammer is or how plumbing works. But when we talk to contractors or go to Home Depot, she always brings me with her. Why? So they listen to her, so they take her seriously. Do I have any idea what she's talking about? Nope. Do I know how to retrofit a ventilation system on a 1950s house? Nope. She does, but I am a man. So it's important for me to be there so they listen. Sometimes they still don't listen, so I'll repeat what she says even though I have no idea what it means. I'll be like, we need someone to install closed cell polyurethane foam in place to achieve R3 insulation, R30 insulation. That's gibberish to me, but now they get it because I'm a man, repeating what my wife just told them a few seconds before. Anyway, just another every example of everyday sexism. I hope you enjoyed this. By the way, my wife wrote it. So this is an example. And we all laugh at it because it's funny, because we can see it, right? We see it reflective of what we experience. But my question is, why is she bringing him? That's my question. Why does she buy into this? She's complicit by sitting inside of that expectation that they're not going to listen to me because I'm a woman. Instead, I would love for her to figure out how to be listened to. It's the same thing at the boardroom. Yes, you got talked over. Figure out how to not get talked over. So that's my challenge to all of us, is just to notice where we're slightly comfortable with the way things are, but then we say we're not. So if she was comfortable with this, then be comfortable with it. But to make a big deal about it and then still keep doing it, for me, that integrity thing is not there. So how do we be in more integrity around the change that we actually want to see? My lens on the world is it's going to be hard. We're going to have circumstances. So how do we get more powerful? That accommodation is not making her ultimately more powerful. What it's doing is making it easier in this moment. And that's why we do those accommodations, because sometimes, quite frankly, we don't want it to be always hard. I'm not mad at her for making that choice. I'm just saying it's not going to get her ultimately to what she says she wants, which is equality. And that's the thing that I want us all to examine is yes, I get that it's hard. And I get sometimes we don't want it to be hard. But if we stay in that place, nothing ever changes. That's where I'm going with it. So I had a chance to sit in a conversation with Michael Tubbs, who's the mayor of Sacramento, Stockton, and Valerie Jarrett. And they were talking about being at the table and earning a right. And both of these people are at tables where decisions are getting made. And the one thing they said is, once you're at the table, be willing to say something. Be willing to actually create the thing that you were there to create instead of accommodating. So this is kind of where I'm going, because if you don't build the capacity in those little moments, when you get to the table, you won't have it then. You'll do the same pattern behavior. And this is what I see happening with my senior leaders and my senior women leaders, is they revert back to those roles and the behavior inside of those roles and the definitions of what those roles assign to what a leader is and what a female leader is. So what happens is I see them in these moments having to choose, am I going to be a woman or am I going to be a leader? And they don't get that they don't have to make that choice because they haven't practiced. So to me, I'm very much a proponent of, if you don't practice it, you're not going to be good at it. And it's not going to magically show up for you. And then what happens is, by the way, you end up in the world making a big deal about a bunch of stuff. And that's what people will tell you. Why are you making such a big deal about this? I'm making a big deal about it so you'll be ready when you get in the room. And so you have to be comfortable with disruption, including your own disruption. Otherwise, you won't show up. Here's the thing, you're going to only lead if you think you can handle it. That's the bottom line. So that's why I advocate for taking these small moments where the impact is low and practicing and building a competency, building up your trust, seeing that your relationships won't completely fall apart. They will get challenged. And you can get to the other side of that challenge. Because if you don't have the practice, you'll have in the back of your mind that you can't handle it. What we do when we can't handle stuff is we lock it into that bucket of fear, and then we start acting all kinds of ways other than leaderly. So part of what I want you guys to think about is, where in your lives do you feel like you can't handle it? And no one wants to have this conversation. You'd be surprised at how many times I try to have a conversation about fear, and I use that word, and people are like, no, I'm not afraid. I'm just blah, blah, blah. But that's kind of what, no, that's not what it is. So we have this way that we just don't even want to acknowledge what we can't handle. The problem with that is, if you can't acknowledge it, then you never get to a place where you can handle it. So I literally want you guys to think about not even this nice language of handling it, but where are you afraid? Like really, really afraid. And the first step, I think, to handling it is to realize that you don't think you can handle it. Because otherwise you'll walk around acting like you got it handled and you don't. And so the first step is to locate yourself in the change and to say, look, this is scary. And once you know that, then you have two options. It's like, get better and get help. Or not. Or stay afraid and not being able to handle it. Those are your two choices. Deal with it or not. And once you know what it is, once you know whatever you guys talked about, now you can go get help and get better. And then just become something on your to-do list and you move through it. But as long as it stays in that bucket of unexamined things that you can't handle, you will not move towards it. You will get in your own way. So this, by the way, is why you see women who are really, really comfortable with patriarchy. I was talking to a friend the other day about this, and she's someone who does leadership development. She feels like she's in an active fight around equality. And I said to her, you know what? I'm not sure how this is going to go, but I would like you to consider the fact that you like patriarchy. And her head, like I could see it, like it just exploded. And she called me back 2 days later and she said, you know what, I want you to know something. I want you to know I'm still thinking about that. And I, when you said it, I knew the truth of it, and I could not handle it at the time, and I did not want to handle it because I don't want it to be true, and it is true. And what we were talking about is that there's a lot of things that you get when you're not equal, which is you don't have to make decisions. You don't actually have to handle anything. You don't have to be as afraid. Now, I'm not saying that that balances out all the other stuff that you got to deal with. But if we're not careful about what we can't handle, we can end up paying tribute to the very thing that we say we don't want because we won't handle it. So that's why I'm spending some time kind of blowing this topic out, because we have to look at the ways that we are actually encouraging the thing that we say we don't want, because we're not willing to handle things. So if I go into a meeting and I don't speak, I'm not handling that, and so I don't have to mess up. I don't run the risk of getting it wrong. So if I know I'm doing that, then I should also understand that I haven't earned the right to be upset about that. That's no one else's fault, actually, in that situation. That's a choice I made, and I need to own that choice. And in owning that choice, I might make a different choice, but I need to be aware of how the places where I'm actually getting in my own way around this. So, as you move towards the right in this model, what it starts to build is increasing capacity to handle things, particularly if you're operating at the top row. When you're operating at the bottom row, you're still kind of resistant to it. You're kind of like, I'm going to do it if I have to. I'm going to do it because my boss told me. I'm going to do it because I feel like I don't have any other choice right now. But you're going to not really want it. You're not going to own it. When you're in a breakthrough belief, you're like, okay, let me see if I can get through this. Let me survive this. When you're in a creative belief, you're like, I'm actually here to own this. That's the difference. You're claiming it, you're owning it, you're willing to be in the consequence of it. That's a very different mindset. One of the things that I've been observing is the places, I talked to you about where women are, here's the power they've earned and they're operating down here. I actually started to think about what's actually going on in that situation. What's happening? What are we seeing? How are people showing up? And one of the things I notice is that someone will be very, very influential, meaning I have a point of view, I'm going to share it, I have conviction about it, kind of like what Martina was talking about. Here's what the market says. They get a no. Mark says to her, no. I'm not buying it. Often what I'll see women do is then try to go to persuasion. Well, the data says, and here's what everybody else is doing, and they start to move further and further away from this place of influence, which is, here's what's available to you. If you want it, you can have it or not. And there's certain ways, we heard a lot from Dr. Pfeffer about how to be more powerful, how to be influential. You can weave that all into this. But somehow we leave that space. We leave the space of knowing, and we start to lean into the other person and try to convince. And it's not the same as influence, right? And then when we try to convince and persuade and that's not working, then we try to control. Well, then maybe you're not going to go with the way I want you to go on this, so I'm going to go find another ally to control the situation because I haven't been influential myself. I'm going to go find somebody else to make my case for me. That's fine if you're doing it from a place of influence, but if you're doing it from a place of control, what you're trying to do is actually manage something instead of influence something. That doesn't work. Then maybe you feel like, well, then I'm just never going to bring up an idea again because you don't listen anyway. This cycle happens almost in every conversation I'm in with people. People who happen to be women, by the way. Men don't do it as much. They'll stay in the influence space. But I often see what happens with women is when they get a no, they start to use all these other strategies to try to get back to yes instead of staying powerfully in their point of view and learning how to get better or get help in influencing inside of this point of view. So I had a conversation with someone Thursday, where she had a task. I'm working with this team of leaders, 4 of them. The senior leader asked for some feedback from his team because he wasn't going to be at the meeting. He said, this is a great time to get feedback about me, and then they could share that with me. So I mined for the feedback. And I said, okay, your job, now that we know what we're talking about, your job, each of you, is to go talk to this leader, have the conversation, and then we're going to come together as a group to make sure you had it with the accountability that I know you guys need to have around it, and we'll have a path forward. So I'm talking to this one leader in the meetings tomorrow, and I said, did you have your conversation? And she said, no. And I said, why not? Well, because I'm getting ready to go out on leave and all the circumstances. I was like, there's been a month. You've had time. Why haven't you had it? Well, because when we had the first meeting, this other thing was prioritized, and then he had some feedback for me, so I didn't want to give him feedback inside of the same meeting. And I said, okay, you've had a month. Why didn't you have the conversation? well, he's not going to be able to do anything with the feedback for, until January anyway, because I'm out and the business cycle is different, so he's not going to be able to do anything with it. I said, why didn't you have the conversation? This is not a problem. I don't know why you're making a big deal about this, Stacy, because I can have this conversation with him. That's not the issue. Why didn't you have the conversation with him? Why are you making such a big deal? I said, I'm making a big deal about it because the way you're showing up here is the way you're going to show up in any conflict situation. You say you can have the conversation, yet you didn't. So there's something going on. And she was so mad at me. She was so mad at me. We fast forward through the conversation, and what it comes down to is she's like, I don't think he's going to change. I said, that's why you didn't give him the feedback, right? She's like, that's why I didn't give him the feedback. And I said, so let's talk it through this in this model. So you had a point of view. You were really clear with it with me. And it was a compelling point of view. But you didn't show up inside of that because you felt like you've tried to do that before. You felt like you've tried to be influential before, and it didn't happen. So then you tried to persuade, because by the way, what she does now is she manages him. She knows that he's not going to change, so she adapts and accommodates for this. I said, so now you're trying to control it, right? So you're preempting what you think is going to happen by controlling it. And by the way, you got 3 more jobs than you need because you're trying to control it. And I said, you not having that conversation with him was a manipulation, because you were manipulating your own feelings. You didn't want to feel disappointed, so you didn't have the conversation, and that's the manipulation. And she's like, oh, I see. So if we're not careful, we get way down the path very, very quickly. The problem with that is it is the least influential place, or the least powerful place to be. On this side of the spectrum, you're responding, you're not being reactive. You're more direct, it's faster, it's less effort, because you don't have to keep cycling. You actually get leverage on this side of the spectrum. You don't have to do it yourself. It's more aligned, it's more committed, it's more sustainable. But it's also where conflict resides. When there's a difference of opinion, you actually have to be really compelling. You have to come up with a deeper, more compelling argument. And if you're not willing to do that work, or you don't think you can handle it, you start to do all the other stuff. My suggestion is to get better at being compelling, because it's a lot less work. But the other thing, the other thing about this basketball experience that I will bring into this is what I know about going from good to great is you have to get good. I mean, you have to actually be great to be great. And I know that sounds silly, but you can't just all of a sudden want to be great. You have to put in the work. You have to develop your competency. You have to treat yourself as a craftsperson. You have to actually be great to be influential. And if you think there's a shortcut, there isn't. So that's part of the reason, when you decide that you're going to be in an anti-fragile creative space, you better go get excellent about whatever it is you're doing. Because that's the only way you can actually operate from a place of influence, which I am defining slightly different than power, by the way, and the way Dr. Pfeffer defined it. I'm talking about it in this place of personal power. That makes sense. Because one of the things that he mentioned that is a reality of the world is that you don't have to be particularly competent to have power. That is absolutely true, but that's organizational power. I'm talking about as someone who's underrepresented and trying to navigate inside of that world. You have to know that you know your stuff. Otherwise, you will be inside of a limiting belief, which is, by the way, true, which is you might have had a situation where you failed or where it didn't go well, and you're going to remember that because it was true, and you'll be operating inside of that. So in order to be in an anti-fragile place, you have to develop your competency. You have to know that you can handle it.